Howdy.
Hi, everyone.
I'll stop crunching.
Hello.
Hello.
So nice to see you
I need a
all.
better virtual background.
Oh, are we experimenting with our backgrounds?
Yeah, I need a nicer virtual background. This is my own background.
I see that Russell's is excellent. Oh, you're muted.
It's a meeting of clergy.
Oh, that's cool.
Awesome.
I'm
All right,
gonna go on mute.
7:01. So we'll give people to 7:03, and then we'll go ahead and get started, and they
All right.
can.
Okay. I'll be here. I'll be on mute.
Okay.
JetBlue just announced you have to fly with a mask. I think I'm never going to fly again. Who can sit in a plane for 8 hours with a mask?
The FAA is going to rule that in a matter of days to get confidence in the system. I think it's going to happen because they want people to, when it's ready to start traveling. Not they want it too fast from New York, but
Right.
at some point. I think FAA will just say it's not going to be piecemeal. It's going to be the rule because then they can enforce it. And if you don't wear it, kick you off the plane.
I have a hard time with that mask. No. No.
All right.
Rabbi, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
Okay. Sorry, I couldn't tell I was talking. I'm, doing okay. I'm
Hey, wait. Oh, you mean you're due soon? You're always sitting down.
really, yeah, I know, right? The good strategic of me. Getting fairly uncomfortable. I'm due like a month.
Oh, wow.
So 5 weeks kind of at the most.
Wow. That was fast.
I know. Isn't it amazing how quickly that happened?
Yes. But it's not you.
Hello.
Yeah, I think it's faster for us than it is for Amanda.
Right.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. I'll go ahead and mute everybody at this point. I know that you're all you've all become Zoom experts at this time. And I'm not quite a Zoom expert yet, but I'm working on it. But I really welcome your contributions to the conversation. And so please, at any time, feel free to use the raise hand on the side if you go to the participants bar. And also just feel free to unmute yourself and just chime in. I may not know who's talking right away, so just say, who it is and either what your question or what your comment is. So good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to have a chance to see you again. I miss the opportunity to be with the Melton group every week, so it's really a special treat to get to be here with all of you tonight. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge in this group that a member of our Melton cohort, Jeff Escher, sadly has passed away in the past few days. And so I wanted to acknowledge that with this group. I know that we all send our condolences and our prayers to his family, and we would say Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing. And how sad we are to see, not only a member of our congregation, but a member of this Melton group who is no longer with us. Jeff, by the way, one of his claims to fame is that he organized our high holiday shofar blowers every year. So you would always see him standing in the front of the main sanctuary blowing the shofar, and he was the one who corralled all of the other shofar blowers, and so his presence will certainly be very missed as well on the high holidays this year. So with that, it actually seems fitting then that we move into a conversation about memory, and that is about memory in the Jewish calendar, and the Israeli calendar in particular. So our conversation this week is going to center around the Israeli observances of Yom HaZikaron, that's Israel's Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israel's Independence Day. Those are the two holidays that the Melton curriculum has us focusing on, but it's incomplete to focus on those two holidays without talking about Yom HaShoah, without talking about Holocaust Remembrance Day, which I know you all discussed as part of your curriculum last week. The three observances are really an arc in the Israeli calendar, really a way of creating a narrative around the creation of the Jewish state. And these three holidays happen in very close proximity. Of course, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, was last week. And today we observed Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for those who fell in battle protecting and helping to establish the land of Israel, also victims of terror. And this evening we transition into Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. It's really an exciting and also really a fascinating time to be in Israel, because the mood transitions from one of solemnity, one of sadness, into one of the most celebratory days of the year very quickly. And so a lot of this is about sort of managing the transition from one holiday to the next. And like I said, this sort of creates a narrative arc in Israel's story, right? The story of the 6 million lost in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, which in many ways helped to lead us to the establishment of the state of Israel. So we're going to be in your Rhythms of Jewish Living book on page 295. We'll kind of briefly talk about Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day, Memorial Day, and then we'll transition into a conversation around Yom HaAtzmaut, which is the focus of most of this week's lesson. So we'll start by talking about Yom HaZikaron. And what better way to start discussing Yom HaZikaron than by reading what was the law that was passed by the Israeli Knesset around Yom HaZikaron that talks about what this observance looks like on the Jewish calendar. So we're on page 295. And we'll go ahead and read through fairly quickly the Memorial Day law for the fallen of Israel's wars. And then I'll have some questions for discussion for us.
Work for you, Bob? No.
Oh, is somebody having trouble with sounds like someone may be having trouble. I'm gonna go ahead and mute, but I see Alan's hand raised. So Alan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
I just had a question. Did Jeff pass away from COVID related problems?
You know, I'm not sure. Of course, you know, as a member of the clergy team, the confidentiality of members of our congregation is something.
I can answer that if you're.
So if somebody else feels as though that they have information that that they are able to share, then certainly.
I do.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. He was a member of our Dixieland jazz band. He was a trumpet player, and he was a friend of mine. I was also a shofar blower. And I heard only 3 days ago from one of the other members of the band that he died. And I spoke to his wife, Monique, yesterday. She also sadly has the virus, but he worked in nursing homes. He was a gerontologist, a doctor who treated the elderly. And without doubt, that had to have been the source of his infection. But he died 3 days ago. Thank
you. I appreciate your being able to share a little bit more information with our community, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to, just, you know, without permission of a family. We always like to assume that any information shared with the members of the clergy team is confidential. So thank you. And so with that, we will move to page 295. And we will read the Knesset's edict or law for the observance of Memorial Day in the land of Israel. So we see that it takes place on the 4th of the Jewish month of Iyar. It says the 4th of Iyar will be the Memorial Day for soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces who made the ultimate sacrifice in order to assure the existence of the state of Israel, as well as those who fell in the campaigns to create the state of Israel, to memorialize them and pay tribute to their courage. And then it talks about when the holiday is commemorated. If the 4th of Iyar falls on a Friday, Memorial Day will be commemorated on the 2nd of Iyar that year. If it falls on a Thursday, Memorial Day will be commemorated on the 3rd of Iyar that year. If it falls on Sunday, Memorial Day will be commemorated on the 5th of Iyar that year. Basically, this is just to help us avoid commemorating either Yom HaZikaron or Yom HaAtzmaut, which immediately follows on Shabbat. Number 2, the beginning of Memorial Day. Memorial Day begins from dusk on the 3rd of Iyar, or 4th or 2nd as required, and ends upon the appearance of stars on the following day. The rules of observance of Memorial Day. On Memorial Day, 2 minutes of silence will be observed throughout the entire country, during which all work and travel will cease. Flags will be lowered to half-mast in all public buildings. Commemorations and public gatherings will take place. Ceremonies will take place in army bases and in educational institutions. Broadcasts will convey the uniqueness of the day. Prohibition of public amusements. On Memorial Day, public amusements will be prohibited. Cafes will be closed from Memorial Day Eve, from the beginning of Memorial Day until dawn the following day. Those who violate the instructions in small paragraphs A or B will be subject to a fine. Absence of relative from work. A relative of a fallen soldier is allowed to be absent from work on Memorial Day, but will be treated as if he had worked on that day. In this regard, a relative will be parents, grandparents, spouse, children, brothers, and sisters. Orders for carrying, okay, we can stop there. So I have some questions for discussion around this, but before I ask those, does anybody have any questions about what we just read, or any comments that they want to share about what we've just read? I'm just scrolling through to see if I see any hands up, or you can feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, so what I wanted to ask for our discussion is, what do you think is the impact of having formal legal restrictions around Memorial Day in Israel? Obviously, this is a fairly unique and fairly specific set of restrictions around the way in which we commemorate Memorial Day, in a way that we in the United States don't necessarily experience. And so, how does it strike you, and what do you think is the impact of having an actual formal legal restriction around this? Yes, Andy or Joni, whoever raised their hand.
I mean, I think it's very nice that there are these formal restrictions, because it does really force people to focus on the purpose of the holiday. And I think about Memorial Day in this country, which people treat as, oh, it's great, it's a 3-day weekend, it's the beginning of summer, we'll go to the beach house, we'll get together with friends and have a barbecue, and it becomes a festive as opposed to a solemn occasion.
Not to mention sales.
And the stores open and have Memorial Day sales, and you lose sort of the purpose. Yes, I remember in my hometown, there would be a parade and the veterans would march in the parade, and maybe you might go down and watch that, and probably a lot of towns still do that, but it's certainly not the focus of the day for many people. My question for maybe those that have been in Israel on Yom HaZikaron, are the beaches full of people? Are people out shopping, despite the edict and everything else? How do the people actually treat the day versus what the law is?
Well, so I've spent time in Israel over Yom HaZikaron, and people take it very, very seriously, and it's quite clear that in some way everyone in the country has been touched or has experienced, either in a close or an extended way, the loss of somebody in a war or in a terrorist attack, and even those who haven't necessarily experienced a direct loss, served in the army, so understood the risk that they were taking, and take the day very seriously. Every school has a ceremony to commemorate Yom HaZikaron. There's a big ceremony on Mount Herzl, and there's also a big ceremony at the Western Wall, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. But the tone of Memorial Day in Israel is vastly different. And then when you get to Yom HaZikaron, that's when everybody's on the beach and everyone's having a barbecue. But for Yom HaZikaron, it is a very solemn day. So I see another hand up from Diane. I think you're unmuted already.
Actually, it's Mike Rahimi. The computer her name, but that's
Mike.
I'll add to what you just said, only in that having lived in Israel for, 15 years or 12 years or something, everybody has family that they lost in almost every single war. Israel is still a young country, and its memory is relative. I mean, you don't need a long memory to know people who died in 48 or 56 or 67 or 73. In another 200 years, who knows how they're going to celebrate if you're comparing it to the United States.
Right.
But everything is too fresh in their minds, let alone all the terrorist attacks and everything else that have gone on in between. So it's a very real and solemn holiday to everybody living there.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely agree. And there's also very much a sense that that there's no time during which people should feel entirely safe or entirely out of danger, and that feeling is also present every year, which is that it's really the continued sacrifice of so many people in the land of Israel that allows the country to continue to exist. So Mark and Sarah, I'm gonna unmute you as well.
So yeah, I would say thank you for Amanda and Mike, both those comments. I think they're absolutely right. And the difference is that it's not that it forces people to remember, it's that it allows people to remember. And it's a very different sense. And I don't know that we here can get that sense, because like you both said, everybody knows somebody who has died defending the country. And
Amanda, what you said about people, the high schools commemorating it, the alumni go back to the high schools, and so it's a shared memory with your peers of friends or teachers that were lost.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about how this isn't a law that forces people to commemorate. It's one that allows and gives people the space and the structure in order to commemorate. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not as though people feel that they're, forced to, to commemorate those lost on this day. I think that this just provides the structure and the societal framework to allow for that commemoration as well. And I see Fran asks, do cars stop on the streets with the sound of a siren on this holiday? The answer is yes. And I'm actually, in just a minute, I'm going to play a video of the siren. And so why was the date chosen? So the state of Israel was proclaimed the day after this. And so that was the date established for Yom HaAtzmaut for Israel's Independence Day. And so therefore the day before became Yom HaZikaron. And I think, it was very intentional that we are remembering the sacrifice of those who helped us to establish the state of Israel immediately before we're celebrating Israel's establishment. So Linda, gonna unmute you as well. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, Israel is different than we are because everybody serves in the army. So that there's a much greater participation in army life than there is here. My guess is after World War II, Memorial Day had a bigger significance here than it does now, the memorial event.
Yes, and absolutely. There's the fact that everybody serves in the army, I think, adds a real buy-in from the whole country to the holiday, because everybody either has taken that risk or is going to take that risk in defense of the state of Israel. So Jonathan, unmuting you as well.
Actually, I apologize. It's Karen.
Oh.
And my son signed on for our grandchildren earlier today, so I appear as Jonathan.
Got it. Okay. Hello.
No, my comment was that I have been in Israel a few times during these two holidays, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and I was so incredibly moved by and impressed by the solemnity of the day, that everyone really embraces it, and the way that the cars absolutely stop on the highways, and that they take this very solemn moment to honor the memory of the fallen soldiers. It's just incredibly moving, and therefore very different from how we commemorate our Independence Day. And one of my strongest memories was that I was in a school of children, maybe kindergartners or nursery school kids, and they were asked to all stand as HaTikva was being played. And there were a number of Ethiopian children in this classroom also, and they all took it so seriously. So from a very early age, they understand that this is a very important, meaningful, and solemn holiday.
Yeah, absolutely. It's true. And it's very moving. And we'll see, a little demonstration of that in just a moment with the siren. So, so we'll take one more comment, and I see, Alan, that your hand is raised, but I'm not sure if maybe it was just raised from before or if it's raised for now as well. I'll unmute you and you can let us know. I'm trying to unmute you. Okay. Alan, you're unmuted. Did you have your hand raised from before? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's take just a minute now. I'm going to share my screen so that everybody can have an opportunity to sort of see what it looks like when the siren goes off for Yom HaZikaron, and how people react to that, and how cars, stop on the street. It's, I think it's hard to truly understand what this day symbolizes without an opportunity to experience it. So you can see what a powerful moment that was. You couldn't see that the cars stopping on the sides of the street because that's a particular street in Jerusalem where the light rail runs, and so it's cars aren't allowed to drive there, but cars do stop on the side of the street and people step out of their cars. But if anyone's been to Jerusalem, you'll see that's a street that's directly next to Ben Yehuda Street. So that's in downtown Jerusalem. I believe that was Jaffa Street, which is directly next to Ben Yehuda Street. And I think one of the most powerful things about seeing this take place in Jerusalem is that you're seeing what we would call religious Israelis and secular Israelis standing side by side. You saw a lot of yarmulkes, and there's a real sense of this being almost like a religious observance in certain ways, and that's actually one of the questions that the Melton curriculum asks us in these. And one of our participants just mentioned to me that this almost seems like a modern high holidays. And I think, in a lot of ways, it really does serve that kind of function in Israel. And so we're gonna transition now into a conversation about Yom HaAtzmaut, about Israel's Independence Day. And like I mentioned, there are a lot of questions around what exactly the nature of this holiday is. Is it a purely secular holiday? It's an Israeli holiday, or is it a Jewish holiday with perhaps some sorts of religious significance to it as well? And you'll see that people sort of fall on both sides of the spectrum in answering that question. And so we're going to take a look today at 3 different prayer books and how Yom HaAtzmaut, how Israeli Independence Day is recognized in those 3 prayer books. So, what kind of a holiday is it? Before we start to look at those prayers together, I'd just like to ask all of you, do you think Yom HaAtzmaut, do you think Israel's Independence Day should be considered like a secular holiday, an Israeli holiday, or do you think it should be actually part of the Jewish calendar? Or is one inseparable from the other? Any thoughts on this? All right, Andy.
This time it's Joni.
It's Joni, sorry.
I think it belongs in the diaspora as well, because we're invited to become part of Israel anytime we want to, and we're welcome to visit there. Most welcome. They need us to visit there. The Israelis do. And also, it always makes me wonder, so many things in our tradition are from ancient times. And I love the fact that there are some things that are not tradition, that are new. And that, especially as a Reformed Jew, we are evolving. And we're not just sitting back there in 70, CE. And that's where it all stopped.
So you're bringing up a really important point, which is that this is like really the first, the Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut are, some of the first Jewish holidays added to the calendar in thousands of years, which I think is fascinating, and which is a really interesting segue to taking a look at how the Jewish tradition has addressed Yom HaAtzmaut before. I think it looks like that there are some more hands up here. And I have to apologize. Oh, I see, Marcia, you have a hand raised. I will unmute you. Hold on one second. For some reason, Marcia, your video is not unmuting. Are you able, or your sound is not unmuting? Are you able to unmute yourself? Let's try this.
Have it press the space bar.
I think you're unmuted now. Oh, the space bar. Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, you are unmuted, but we're still not able to hear you. I'm not sure maybe what the issue may be with your audio. Why don't you work on it just for a minute, and we'll hear from a few other people, and then see if we can get you to chime in at that point. Okay. I'm gonna unmute right here. I see the letter D, but I don't see the rest of the name on my screen. For some reason, my computer is not unmuting very well. So if you had something to contribute to the conversation, please just go ahead and unmute yourself. And we'd love to hear your comments. I'm not sure what the issue is with my computer.
Well, if the D you saw was Diane Drew, it's really Mike Rahimi.
Okay.
I would argue that it is an Israeli holiday, not a Jewish holiday.
Okay.
And while we can celebrate Israel's Independence Day in the United States or in other countries, we're celebrating Israel's Independence Day and our allegiance to our fellow Jews who happen to be Israelis, more than a religious holiday. So I'd say it's a nationalist political holiday.
Okay. And so that is the view held by some, and the view held by others, of course, is that this is a religious holiday. So would somebody else like to go ahead and unmute yourself? And
It's Ed. I agree with, let me see if I get my video. I agree with that. I mean, I guess the question is, if Israel wasn't a Jewish state, would you feel the same way? That's why I do, in some ways, I do think of it as a religious holiday, even though it's put in the context of a state holiday.
Right. So if Israel's meant to be the homeland for the homeland of the Jewish people, then
yeah, if you were Greek and it's Greek National Day, would you feel the same way as a country as opposed to religion, I guess is the question.
I think that's a great question. All right, others.
Yeah, so I agree with Mike. I think this is a nationalistic holiday, and if you were in Greek and you had a Greek Independence Day, it would be a Greek Independence Day. It would not be a Greek Orthodox religious holiday. So, I mean, I think this is an Israeli holiday, and I think we can all celebrate it, whether we're in Israel or in the diaspora. I just don't view it as a religious occurrence.
But to push back a little, Scott, we're not Israelis. But we identify with Israel because I would say I identify with Israel as a Jewish state.
As an ethnic group, we identify with them. It doesn't make it a religious holiday in my mind. It's more ethnic than it's religious.
I agree.
Well, so religious and political leaders have asked the same question with very heated debates, and the biggest, I guess, Jewish controversy around this question is the question of whether we recite the Hallel prayers. So Hallel are the prayers that we recite on festivals. It's a collection of psalms that we recite on the festival days, on days of joy in the Jewish calendar. And so the big debate and question has been around, do we recite Hallel on the holiday of Yom HaAtzmaut? If we do, then that would imply that it's a Jewish holiday, and if we were to not, it would imply that that it's in some ways an Israeli or a secular holiday. So if you turn to page 300 in your books, what you might be surprised to learn is that major prayer books from the three major denominations of Judaism, so the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox movements, have all included liturgy for Yom HaAtzmaut in their prayer books. Like I said, there's still there is still a substantial number of people who disagree that this should be part of the Jewish calendar, but all 3 prayer books have included a liturgy for it, which I think is fascinating. And so we're actually going to look at an example of that liturgy from each of the major movements of Judaism. So we're going to start with the Orthodox movement. We'll look at something from the Reform movement. From the Conservative movement. And then we'll look at something from the Reform movement, and we'll look at how each of the different denominations of Judaism recognizes Yom HaAtzmaut in its religious texts, and what that says about different ways of understanding and of viewing the holiday. So we'll start by looking at an excerpt from a prayer book that's called Rinat Israel. This is it's an Orthodox traditional prayer book, mainly used in Israel, and it's very much considered just like the standard Hebrew prayer book for Orthodox Jews in Israel. So we won't go through and read the entire thing, but I'll sort of walk us through what's in it. So we start by reading the instructions. Festival clothing is worn, and the community gathers in the synagogue and mass. The evening prayer is recited in a festive melody. The cantor recites the following, and the congregation repeats. So we start with these words from the book of Deuteronomy, these words we all know, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And then Adonai hu ha-Elohim, which means the eternal is God. Then we say, the cantor recites the following, and the congregation repeats. This is a text, this is an ancient text that's called Mi She'asa Nisim. This is a text that starts, I'll read it first and then I'll explain a little bit about it. May God, who has performed miracles for our ancestors and for us, and who has redeemed us from slavery to freedom, soon redeem us with the consummate redemption and gather our dispersed ones from the 4 corners of the earth, binding all of Israel together in fellowship. Now let us say Amen. So this is a text that's inserted into the Amidah prayer on the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim. So holidays during which God performed some sort of a miracle that saved the Jewish people from harm in some way. So that text is included here as well. Then we read from the book of Numbers, this selection, when you are at war in your own land against an aggressor who attacks you, you shall sound short blasts on the trumpets, so that you may be remembered before the eternal your God and be delivered from your enemies. And on your joyous occasions, your fixed festivals and new moon days, you shall sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and your sacrifices of well-being. They shall be a reminder of you before the eternal your God. I, the Lord, am your God. Then we blow the shofar and we say, next year in rebuilt Jerusalem. Then we sing at the bottom of the page a selection from Psalm 126. We sing a text called Ani Ma'amin, which we also sing, by the way, on Yom HaShoah, which means I believe. And the text is literally, I believe with full faith in the coming of the Messiah. So that's the text in the Orthodox prayer book. So the very first thing that I want to ask you is, what are the things that you notice about this text? What's in this text? What's missing from this text? What are the themes of this text? What is it, what are these prayers focusing on? So like I said, for some reason, my computer is not doing the best job of unmuting people. I'm going to try one more time. Ed, I'm trying to unmute you. It's not working. So go ahead, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
All right, perfect. Oh, I saw your hand was raised. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, no, that was like 4 questions.
From before?
I was playing with the questions. Sorry, don't worry about
Got it. Oh, no problem. And I see that Deborah has a hand raised as well. I don't know if that's from before or from now. All right, so I'll ask anybody, any observations about this before I point them out on my own. And you can just unmute yourself and share.
I find it interesting that although it's the declaration, it's the Independence Day, it's the whole celebration is aimed from the people outside of Jerusalem.
Okay, So if I can add to what you're saying as well, you're talking about it's people outside of Jerusalem and
outside of Israel.
Right. And so, and what's not even implicit, what's explicit in this is we see, for instance, next year in rebuilt Jerusalem, or I believe in the coming of the Messiah. So there's some sort of an implication here that the establishment of the modern state of Israel is not representative of that redemptive time of the coming of the Messiah, right? That there's some sort of separation still between the establishment, the political establishment of a modern state of Israel, which is something that we're celebrating in, you know, in a religious text, but we're not going so far as to say the Messiah has come and, you know, we've been redeemed and now we're back in the land of Israel and we're gonna, you know, build the third temple, right? So we haven't gone that far. Yes, I think that's something really important to point out here. Other things that others notice.
Well, there's a repeated connection between God and Israel. I mean, pretty much every section of this prayer connects God and Israel together.
So I think that's a second point I was gonna share with everybody as well. You see here that all of this is praise of God, right? There's nothing here that's recognizing in any way any contributions of people in the establishment of the land of Israel. This is totally focused on God's hand and God's deliverance in the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And I think that that's, you know, just something really important to recognize, particularly because we've just come out of Yom HaZikaron, during which we're honoring all of the people who were involved in the establishment of Israel, and those people aren't mentioned here. You know, sort of reminds me a little bit of the Passover Haggadah, where Moses isn't mentioned at all in the Passover Haggadah. This is, you know, something interesting to note. Anything else?
Keep in mind, this is an Orthodox text.
Yes.
So it has to talk about God primarily.
It does. Yes, I agree. But I think it's also just important to note here. Anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll point out one last thing, which is that there are no contemporary texts included in this. These are all biblical. It's a combination of biblical readings of you know, prayers that are part of the established Siddur, of the established prayer book, like the Misha Asa Nisim prayer, the prayer that thanks God for deliverance on Hanukkah and on Purim. And the Ani Ma'amin text, the I believe text, that's a medieval text, but there's no original liturgical composition here. This is only a compilation of ancient texts. And I wonder what you think. So someone says this actually has nothing to do with modern Israel, right? So not necessarily directly, but indirectly, but I wonder what you think. What is the impact, or what would be the reason for actually not including any original liturgical text here, only including ancient prayers and ancient texts? Any thoughts? So I would suggest that that grounding a contemporary holiday in ancient texts gives it more authenticity and more validity and more grounding in a traditional Jewish prayer book and a traditional Jewish practice, right? If we're to connect this modern holiday to our ancient texts and our ancient prayers, then perhaps it feels like a more valid addition to the contemporary calendar. And I see Fran saying, proof that it is God's will to be celebrating the homeland. Exactly, right? So this is proof that it's God's will that that the modern state of Israel should have been established. So Nancy says, the shofar blown on this day in Israel. In this service, it is. I am thinking back to the ceremonies that I've attended. I haven't seen the shofar blown as something consistent, but that doesn't mean it's not, a practice in certain places. So Fran asks, so does that make it religious, at least for the Orthodox? Yes. So this is a religious holiday for certain groups of Orthodox Jews. This prayer book is not used by the entire Orthodox community, and certainly among many Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox circles, this is not recognized as a Jewish holiday, and the creation of the modern state of Israel is not in any way recognized as God's will. And so this is a prayer book that has a particularly religious, we call it a religious Zionist bent. So that's a subgroup within Orthodox Jews in Israel that are Zionist. There are other Orthodox Jews who still live in Israel who would not consider themselves to be Zionists. Fran, I see your hand up.
So I have a question.
Sure.
What does the Messiah have to do with it? And when does the Messiah get to be talked about in our books somewhere? It's not in Torah.
Right. So that's the really interesting question behind all of this, right? So in the Jewish tradition, the assumption was always that after the diaspora, after the there was some diaspora after the destruction of the first temple, but after the destruction of the second temple, and after the diaspora, that when the Jewish people would again gather in the land of Israel, that would be the Messianic time, the time of the building of the third temple, when the entire Jewish people would all be gathered together in Israel. And this establishment of the modern state of Israel then presents sort of a dilemma within the religious Jewish community, because they don't consider it to be representative of the time of the coming of the Messiah. This is the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people, which they're understanding as God's will, but are not understanding it as the Messianic time during which, for instance, like I said, we would be, building the third temple, and understand that the Messiah has come. And so that's partially kind of what puts this in a creates sort of a difficult status around the holiday, and this question of, are we treating it as a religious holiday? Are we reciting the Hallel prayers, for instance? And the other, and why there's such a big segment of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community that says, this is not a valid observance at all. This was not God's will. This is a bunch of people who are, trying to establish a country before it was God's will that we do so. And so that's part of, kind of where the debate around this comes. Anyone else before we continue? So let's look now. I'm gonna skip, just because I'm kind of mindful of our time, we're gonna skip the conservative movement's prayer in its Sim Shalom prayer book, which is on page 304. And we're gonna skip to the reform movements. So, and again, we won't read the whole thing, but I'll talk you through the whole thing. So this is page 305. This is in Mishkan Tefillah, which is the Siddur, the prayer book that we use at WRT. So this liturgy for Yom HaAtzmaut starts in a very different way. This starts with the preamble of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So it says, Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people. After being forcibly exiled from their land, The people remained faithful to it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. So this this liturgy is really interesting because it starts right off the bat actually with a secular text, and a text that's not grounded in ancient Jewish tradition. So that's really interesting to note. But then it continues with the words of the Psalms. So then it does ground itself in the Jewish tradition. A song of ascents of David. I rejoiced when they said to me, we are going up to the house of the eternal. Our feet stood inside your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem built up, a city knit together. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be at peace. May there be well-being within your ramparts, peace in your citadels. For the sake of my kin and friends, I pray from your well-being. For the sake of the house of the eternal our God, I seek your good. This is a really interesting text to have included here. If you remember back to the text that we read from the Orthodox tradition, we read next year in rebuilt Jerusalem, right? And here we're reading about our feet stood inside your gates, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem built up. So there's an implication here, right? In the Reform movement where we don't necessarily, we're not necessarily waiting for the construction of a third temple, and we don't necessarily believe in the most literal sense about the coming of the Messiah, for instance. There's an implication here that we are to see this almost as the realization of a messianic era, of a redemption for the Jewish people, and that we should see this as the rebuilt Jerusalem. So that's I think a really fascinating implication here. Then the liturgy continues on in the middle of page 306 with a poem by Hannah Senish. Hannah Senish, as many of you know, wrote the text Eli Eli, which is often recited on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and fought before the in pre-state Palestine, fought on sort of on behalf of pre-state Palestine as an advocate for the persecuted Jewish people in Europe, and in I don't remember which country in Eastern Europe was caught and tortured and died that way. And she wrote, build upon sand under the blue sky, everything anew. And know, costly is the road to the just and the true. And then we have a quotation from Albert Einstein. Whatever we do for the land of Israel, we do it for the honor and the well-being of the whole Jewish people. And then the words of Theodore Herzl, if you will it, it is no dream to be a free people in Zion and Jerusalem. And we won't read the rest. I'll just point our attention to one other small part, which is in the middle of page 307. Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive upon and occupy the land that the Eternal is giving you. And at the bottom of the page, Israel is a personal challenge, a personal religious issue. So this is a very different kind of religious liturgy for Yom HaAtzmaut. I can go through and point out some things that I noticed, but I'd love to hear first from you. What do you notice about this text? So I'll point out a few things. I noticed first that it includes ancient text and it includes modern text, right? It includes mention of God and of God's role in the establishment of the state of Israel. And it includes a recognition of the role that people played in the establishment of the land of Israel. It, unlike the text we read before, this text suggests that we should see the establishment of the modern state of Israel as a redemptive time, which is very different from the Orthodox text that we read, which is that Israel is something that we should celebrate, and at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily see it as representative of a messianic era or necessarily of a fully redemptive time. And finally, I'll point out here that this is not a text only of celebration. and of thanksgiving, but it's a text encouraging us to think about what responsibilities we now take on as a Jewish people in the establishment of the land of Israel. When we read, for instance, justice, justice shall you pursue. So it's not only upon us to be grateful for the establishment of the state of Israel, but also it's incumbent upon us now to think about, how we have to act as Jewish people with our own state. So I'm reading here.
Settlements.
What did you say?
Does that imply settlements? Thrive upon and occupy the land that the Eternal has given you. What does that mean?
That's an interesting question that you're asking, and I think that the creators of this prayer book would say no, that it absolutely doesn't, because the reform movement as a whole takes positions that the establishment of settlements, particularly as I'm sure you're thinking of, like for instance in the West Bank, is actually detrimental to the peace and the health of the land of Israel. So I would say that I understand why. Yeah, that's how we're reading this, and I would say that probably the authors of this liturgy would say no, that's not what they were implying in this necessarily. I saw somebody else who wanted to weigh in here. Oh, hi, yeah, Rosenblatts.
Couple of things. I think that this text is really laden with political meaning, and very, at the time it was written, very anti-Likud. And I think that it is also, while you were talking, I was misbehaving, and I read the conservative Siddur, which has, in its short piece, a couple of different references to the fact that there was a triumphant battle. And ours doesn't mention that we actually had to fight to win this. Right. In fact, it almost says, guides us to think that we're going to be good people and we should continue to be good people. And there is a line that you didn't read towards the end, says the religious duty of the Jew is to participate in the process of continuous redemption and seeing that justice prevails over power. Well, not so much. And that's not how the state of Israel came to be. It was power prevailing, and maybe power brought justice. And times have changed since this is written, and you can argue politics. But at the time this was written, I would say this was, by omitting that, you're omitting a story that you might want to let Reform Jews know, and you are very much at that time coming down against Likud. And I would wonder if it were written today, if those lines would still be included.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that you're asking, and there's a real sort of discomfort with and difficulty addressing power and what power means. One of the things I think to point out that's just interesting to note is that the conservative movement's text was published in 1985, and Mishkan Tefillah, the liturgy that was published in the Reform movement's text, was published, I think Mishkan Tefillah, and Rabbi Reiser's here now, I think was published in 2005. So
2007.
2007. Okay, so it was over 20 years later, right? So there are a lot more, I think, questions that are being asked by that point, and so
there are a lot more questions being asked in the Reform movement.
Yeah,
was dominated by a liberal political presence, less so then, more so as Rick has dominated, and also as the movement, as Israelis have changed. I wonder how much our Reform liberal brethren would find comfort in this, or would find this, those dumb Americans. But in any event, never mind that. It is interesting that we don't mention anything that the state of Israel was founded in battle, in loss of life. Isn't that mentioned here?
I think that's absolutely. I think you're bringing up a very, very important point there. And I'm aware too that Rabbi Reiser is here, which means that it's time for us to conclude our first hour together. If I would encourage you, if you have an opportunity to just read one more text here, read on your own text number 8, because what we didn't have an opportunity to get to yet was the perspective of those Israeli thinkers who believe that Yom HaAtzmaut should not be observed as a religious holiday and that it should be fully observed as a secular holiday. And so I think that would be, an interesting additional text for you to read. I'm sorry we don't have time to read it now, but if you have time on your own, please do read it. And I will wish you maybe a Chag Sameach, maybe a happy holiday. I know we didn't come to consensus around whether we should be observing this as a Jewish holiday or not. So for all of those who would consider Yom HaAtzmaut to be a holiday on the Jewish calendar, I wish you a happy holiday. And with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Reiser and just say that it was really wonderful to see everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
So much, Cantor. Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all. I was able to join just for the last 5 for maybe 10 minutes. It sounded like some fruitful topics were engaged. We'll continue with that together now. Before we dive in too deep, and maybe as a way of cleansing our intellectual palates between one topic and the next, just a reminder that we're transitioning now over to the curriculum. So you want to grab your white book. So I've just exercised the meeting host's ability to mute all, and I got a helpful little chat reminder from a participant just reminding everybody to do your best to keep yourselves on mute during the conversation. Zoom doesn't allow for multiple people to speak at a time without creating audio interference. So if you can do your best to remember to unmute yourself to speak and participate, of course, but then when you've had the comment to turn the mute function back on. 2 other just little bits of housekeeping, again, by way of sort of cleansing our intellectual palate, are just to remind you that we are in session tonight, obviously, and we'll be in session again next week on May the 5th, and the week after that on May the 12th, all of those at our usual 7 to 9 via Zoom time, as we've been doing during the WRT campus closure. We'll soon know the status of that closure and whether it extends into later May or beyond, and look for more updates from us on that. But for now, at least this week, the following week, May 5th, and the week after that, May 12th, we're all doing this virtually here on the Zoom platform. One other just little housekeeping reminder is, I'm not sure if Cantor Kleinman mentioned it at the beginning, but you see it in the upper left-hand corner, just a reminder that we are recording these sessions so that people who weren't able to join us in real time can still have the experience of going through the curriculum. So just a reminder that your comments are being recorded. So just be reminded of that. I think the last thing I want to do, this is a question. Did we have a chance at the beginning of the first hour to do any like quick check-ins? They don't even have to be quick they don't have to be quick, but any sort of check-ins? Could I either see by either nods of the head, yes or no, whether we got a chance to sort of check in with one another for 2 minutes at the beginning of the first hour? Want to open up a space for that. It's important while we're not able to connect in real space to make sure we're also able to share not just our thoughts, but our lives with one another. And I have myself one check-in that I want to share with the rest of us, but I first want to see if anyone else has a check-in item that they want to share with the group. And Alan, I think I just saw you raise your hand. Is that right, Alan Broadwin?
Yes.
Go for it. Tell us.
You went through that we're going to be meeting on the 5th and the 12th. What's happening on the 19th when we're having an annual meeting?
Yes, unclear right now. Almost certainly we will move our meeting from the 19th to a different date, but whether it's in the building or virtual, all those things are still up in the air, which is why we haven't said anything about it as of yet.
Okay.
Any other either questions or check-in items people want to share?
I was just going to check in that we celebrated my middle son's birthday on Zoom, and it was the first real Zoom family thing we've done, and it was actually a lot better than I thought it would be. So we all learned new tricks.
That's awesome. Happy Mazel Tov to your family. Hope that it was a nice celebration. Any other people? I see Deborah. Have you just raised your hand for something you'd like to share?
No.
No. Okay. Very good. Let me meet you again here. Then let me share one check-in that I think we should all be aware of. There's a custom in Jewish tradition that sometimes when you engage in a period of study like we do together weekly here in Melton, that you could dedicate that period of study to somebody. The sort of spiritual insight being that when you dedicate a period of study to somebody, it helps to elevate their soul in some way or another. So typically you dedicate a period of study either to someone who's not well and who's in need of prayers of healing. You can also dedicate a period of study to a couple who's celebrating or a family who's celebrating something. And I had intended earlier in the year to have us get into the practice of every week having someone say, I'd like to dedicate our study this evening to so-and-so. We never really established that practice. It's never too late though. And tonight I actually do want to do a dedication of our study, both the hour that's already passed and especially the hour that's coming now. If you subscribe to WRT's Life Cycle Announcements listserv, then you may have seen today the announcement that our congregant and a member of our Melton group, who's in my and Rabbi Miller's cohort, Dr. Jeff Escher, died this weekend. Dr. Escher is best remembered in our congregation for being one of our Ba'alei Tkiyah, one of our shofar blowers. And so if you've ever come on the holidays anytime in the past 20, 30 years, you've seen Dr. Escher blowing the shofar. Dr. Escher grew up at WRT and was here in the days of Rabbi Stern. And he'll be missed by many people, including by me. And I'm sure by others in this group who had him in their cohort. So I want to dedicate our study this evening to the memory of Dr. Escher. For those who were close with him or who care to participate, there'll be a publicly streamed memorial for him on Friday morning on WRT's streaming site at 11 a.m. So this study session is dedicated to Dr. Escher. Did we have a chance to say a blessing for study at the beginning of our time? And I see people shaking their heads no. So let's join together then in our blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu divrei Torah. Blessed are you, our eternal God, sovereign of the universe, who makes our lives holy with sacred responsibilities and commands us to engage in words of Torah. Okay, so we're moving on to the purposes curriculum. And I know that you were studying just a moment ago in the rhythms curriculum about Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and that we are currently, as the sun has just set, on the cusp between those two holidays, and you probably don't need me to say more about them because you've just gone in deep on them. We're moving to a related topic now, which is the Israel-Diaspora Relationship. We're going to see 5 different modern contemporary Jewish thinkers on what the nature of the Israel-Diaspora relationship should be, according to them. My guess is that as we go through each of these texts, each of us will find ourselves resonating with more or less different parts of each of these 5 thinkers. They each kind of represent a different viewpoint on what the relationship ought to be between diaspora Jewry, Jews who don't live in the land of Israel, and Israeli Jewry, Jews who do live in the land of Israel. So our kind of like guiding, well, I've written it down as our big idea, is that the Jewish world has a variety of opinions on the nature and relationship, the nature of the relationship between diaspora Jewry and Israeli Jewry. And kind of like the guiding question that I'd like us all to sort of be thinking about is how do you conceive of the nature of the relationship between diaspora Jewry and Israeli Jewry? Are there parts of each of these thinkers that resonate with you? Is there any one thinker that most resonates with you? Is there any one thinker that like clearly doesn't resonate with you? So that's kind of our guiding principle, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about each of them. Just one more word of setup before we dive right into these 5 different thinkers. Conversations about Israel in the Jewish community are famously sometimes very fraught. They can be hard conversations for the Jewish people to have and to have constructively. My wife, Leah, actually works for a Jewish organization whose entire mission is to help Jewish conversations have better conversations about Israel, to help people who don't quite see eye to eye, at the very least, be able to hear one another. And it's my hope that we can, in this space here together, try our best to hear one another. We don't have to agree with one another, but we should try our best to at least hear what someone else is saying. I believe that these 5 texts, no one of them is going to be like, oh yeah, that's me. If you're anything like me, then I expect, or I imagine that you might say, oh yeah, I see myself in that one. And I also see myself in that one, even though like parts of them are in contrast with each other. That's very Jewish. So with that as a setup, why don't we dive right in? So we're in the Purposes book. I'm actually going to share these texts on the screen too, in case you don't have your book with you. But if you want to follow along in your book rather than on the screen, I'll ask you to turn in the white Purposes reader to page 313. We're going to start with a text by Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory, a leading Reform theologian, most active in the 20th century, although he lived until just the past couple of years. He died in like 2014 or something like that. So we'll read what Dr. Borowitz has to say about the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And again, in a second, I'll share my screen. But before I do share my screen, is there someone who could let us know either by unmuting yourself or by using the raise hand feature who would be willing to be our first reader? Diane, was that you raising your hand? Okay, I've unmuted you. Or at least I'm trying to. Okay, there you go. Let me share my screen and then we'd love to have you read for us this first text.
Nothing moves Jews more deeply these days than the trials and the triumphs of the state of Israel. Such close identification might be explained as ethnic pride or simple admiration for the Israelis' high human accomplishment. But the Jewish concern for the state of Israel goes far deeper than that. Often unconsciously, sometimes consciously, Jews consider it their people's definitive response to the Holocaust, and they therefore treat it with a measure of awe and numinous respect.
You can keep going.
Accomplishing the dreams of generations. The state of Israel, by its very existence, refutes many of the charges anti-Semites have made against Jews. Almost nothing Jews have accomplished in the diaspora could still the slurs that Jews are cowards, radicals, capitalists, parasites, and the like. The state of Israel rebuts such charges in a massive public way that even Jew haters cannot easily ignore. It conclusively demonstrates that given a chance, the Jews are not different from most other people, though in some areas their achievement is quite exceptional. No small measure of Jewish pride in the state of Israel comes from its vindication of our worth, despite the slander of our enemies. Israeli normalcy has not brought anti-Semitism to an end as the early Zionists hoped it would. It has, in large part, shown Jew hatred to be an irrational hatred, seizing on any pretext that might support it.
One more paragraph.
The state of Israel sums up and expresses all our hopes for humanity and all our love of Jewish tradition and the Jewish people. Threats to its survival, therefore, transcend political issues. They assault our most significant evidence that human goodness need not be defeated in history. They attack the most visible and compelling instance of the Jewish people's continuing dedication to the central values of the Jewish tradition. The destruction of the state of Israel would be a shattering blow to the hope by which Jews have survived the ages and worked for the coming of universal justice and peace. Nothing else gives Jews such pride in their people and summons them so to Jewish responsibility.
Thank you so much, Diane. And we'll pause there for just a second. And I'd love to just hear if anyone has any reflections so far on the first half of Borowitz. I guess if there were a question that I'm asking about it, it's how would you characterize what he takes pride in regarding Israel? But you could reflect on anything he said so far. There'll be more to ask in a little more specific way when we read the second half of his statement. But so far, any questions, thoughts, observations? And my guiding question is, what do you see that he takes pride in regarding the state of Israel? You can either just unmute yourself or use the raise hand function. Okay, Diane, go for it. You can unmute yourself.
Oh, all right. I think the main thrust of this is that the accomplishment of the Jews by establishing this state kind of shows the world that we're not any different from anyone else. And he says that really quite explicitly, but also that what we did is something we can take pride in. And it's an example to the world.
Very nice. Yeah, that the establishment of the state sort of normalizes Jewish existence by giving us a place to be a productive member among the family of nations, and also gives Jewish people a feeling of pride in all of Israel's accomplishments. Thanks for pointing that out. Any other comments people want to make at this juncture? Okay, Andy, or maybe it's Joni. Go ahead.
No, it's Andy now. We've been going back and forth. I think it's interesting. It looks like you wrote this in 1984.
Yeah.
And a statement at the beginning, you know, nothing moves Jews, characterizing Jews as a singular being, then the trials and triumphs and close identification. I think if he had written this today, it might be a little bit different. And maybe that's the privilege we have of now being a state for 70-something years, and we're not so unified anymore because now we maybe take it a little bit for granted that we have the state and it's going to exist, and we have the privilege of disagreeing with the state and disagreeing with each other over, you know, what's right and wrong for the state to be doing.
Really nice comment on at least two levels. I'm sure more than that even. But first, noting that the time in which each of these writers wrote informs their perspective in a certain way. You know, 1984 is really not that far off of 1967, when American Jewry really galvanized its strong feelings of Zionism and following like the Black Panthers. I mean, many of you lived through this. I only know this from history lessons. Got really strongly passionate and felt mostly unified around the state of Israel. And really in the time since the 80s, as Andy points out, like with, I think, beginning mostly in the first Lebanon War, there started to be, again, a new refracturing of the Jewish people's sense of what the relationship ought to be between the diaspora and Israel. I say refracturing because in the pre-state era, there wasn't uniformity either. There were Jews who thought that there should be a Jewish state. There were Jews who thought there shouldn't be a Jewish state, that we should maintain our allegiances to the countries where we lived, and that we should be like Bundists, that means like Yiddish socialists. There were people who thought that there should be a Jewish state, but that didn't have to be in the land of Israel, it could be in Uganda. So there never was uniformity. After the 67 war, there was suddenly this uniformity, and then in the early 80s, it started to break down again. So maybe before I call, so a good comment, Andy, first on the time impacting the way that each writer thinks. I forgot what the second thing was I wanted to point out from what you had to say, but I'll let it lie, I guess. Diane, before I call on hands we've heard from already, I want to see if there's anyone else who wants to get in the mix. If not, then I wonder actually if Diane, maybe rather than making a second comment, if you could finish reading the Borowitz passage for us, would that be okay? All right, I've unmuted you. Go for it. Or I'm trying to, at least. Hold on. Okay, go for it. Pause, Diane. I think we're both unmuting you at the same time, which is causing... Diane, are you able to unmute yourself by touching the lower left-hand corner of your screen?
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. Now I'm on the wrong. With all that
divides us.
With all that, the ties between American Jews and the state of Israel have their limits. Most simply put, our bonds are not political, but only ethnic, and in the special sense in which Jewish ethnicity is inseparable from Jewish religion. Since this distinction generates much controversy in the Jewish community, it requires careful examination. One matter seems easily agreed to American Jews owe political allegiance only to the country of their citizenship. As long as we do not change our national status, we pay required taxes only to the United States or Canada. Our funds given to the State of Israel are philanthropy or investment. Here we pledge our
Here in the U.S.
Here we pledge our lives for the defense of our country. There we may become so concerned for the Israeli survivor that we volunteer to assist in their fight. Here we vote and exercise such political power as we have. There we may not appropriately become involved in the political process. The Star-Spangled Banner or Hail Canada is our national anthem. Hatikva, for all that an effort was once made to have it become the chief song of the Jewish people, is the anthem of a foreign country. It, like the Israeli flag, must be treated with the protocol established by our country's laws.
In the last little sentence here.
Short as this list is, it has already brought us to the brink of several major arguments about our relation to the State of Israel.
Okay, thank you so much, Diane, for reading. And let me start with sort of a pshat question. Pshat is like the technical text study term for like basic understanding. Is there someone who could just like clarify for us or say in your own words for us in order to demonstrate understanding the distinction that Borowitz is making between what he says is our political allegiance and our ethnic allegiance? And I'll help spell it out one more time. Our political allegiance to the countries in the diaspora in which we live compared to our ethnic allegiance or our ethnic feelings for the State of Israel. Anyone able to like sort of articulate the difference there? And you can either let us know by unmuting. Okay, Linda, I'm unmuting you. Go for it. We're having the same problem. I'll let you unmute yourself. Go for it.
Unmute myself. Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
All right. So now I forgot what I was going to say by all of that.
Sorry. I was asking about the difference between the ethnic and the political, that the distinction he makes there.
Well, it's very interesting. I just watched The Plot Against America. I don't know how many people got to see this. And there they are talking about how we are Americans first and we owe allegiance to Israel, but we're Americans first. But in that horrible scenario in that show, it didn't matter because if you were Jewish, you were going to be discriminated against and moved out to the far reaches of America. And it was a terrible show. But
so I remember reading the book, and I didn't watch the HBO special, and I can't remember from when I read the book. But a clarifying question: is part of the reason why Lindbergh persecuted American Jewry because of a charge of potential dual loyalty? I think that's maybe what's at stake here, but I'm wondering if that's expressed through the book or the.
I didn't read the book either. I just saw the HBO special. So, and that's certainly one of the things used against us is that our loyalty is really to Israel and not to the United States.
Okay, thanks for bringing that comment. Let me, I'll let Mike unmute yourself because I'm learning that when I try to unmute you, it doesn't work so well.
In the book, it's not, and I read the book recently because I wanted to see the HBO series and actually preferred the book, of course. So I didn't watch the HBO series. But in the book, Roth does not use the whole argument about dual allegiance nearly as much as it's used politically today or has been for the last 10, 15, 20 years or longer. I mean, he's simply talking about the whole anti-Semitism and the pro-Nazi. Lindbergh was an anti-Semite, and that's the thrust of his book, is how Lindbergh was anti-Semitic and tied to Hitler and all sorts of, he goes a little nutty towards the end of the book, but that's what he was focused on more than the dual loyalty. It was just straightforward anti-Semitism.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that for the rest of us. Anyone else able to sort of, and that was granted an aside that I sort of generated by asking about how it plays out in the book. Anyone able to still sort of help us pinpoint the difference between ethnic feeling for the State of Israel and political allegiance as it's seen by Borowitz, or maybe even take it a level deeper and help us to understand what's meant by dual loyalty here? A third question could be, does this argument resonate with you? Do you see it the way that Borowitz is seeing it? And again, before I call on hands we've heard from, I'm going to see if we can get some other voices in the conversation. Okay, so Alan, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Well, I think this is very similar to that age-old debate is, do you consider yourself a Jewish American or an American Jew? And I think that it sounds simple, but when you peel away the layers, it's a complicated question. And I think it's similar in what we've been struggling with since 48.
Very interesting. Yeah. And probably even before 48 too. I mean, like Napoleon, for example, said, you can be Frenchman so long as you're Frenchman first and Jewish second. And that was a shift for America, for French Jews in the early 1800s. So I think even before 48, but 48 makes it even more pronounced in a certain way. Deborah, I'll let you unmute yourself. And it seems that you are.
Okay, thank you. I think a lot of people, when they think of American Jews, they think of the Hasidic Jews who dress differently, who do keep unto themselves quite a bit, and don't really follow a lot of American norms and outright laws. And that sort of confirms in their mind whether or not Jews are loyal to America first, just from what they actually see from people who describe themselves as Jewish.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's a certain otherness that certain Jewish communities present in their way of dress, and it may cause outsiders to experience that otherness as potential dual loyalty. Cynthia, will you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi. Personally, I think it's the difference between like your heart and your love are for Israel, but your brain and your rational thinking and your voting and your doing and paying taxes, that's for the US. But I also feel in the way that me personally, that you're like a stepsister. So you love, it's like a step parent. So it's not really your parent that's going to tell you what to do, or I don't want to go into that relationship because then someone might disagree with what that meaning is, but I do feel it as a stepchild.
Very interesting. That's an interesting metaphor. And I also like the thing about you have a love for it, even if it's not necessarily where you pay taxes to. Okay, I think last comment on this text will be from Fran. Fran, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. So the line here where he says, one matter seems easily agreed to. American Jews owe political allegiance only to the country of their citizenship. So how did that work out for the Germans? My feeling is that we owe political allegiance to the country of our citizenship as long as the country of our citizenship has allegiance to us. And always in our hip pocket, we have Israel, which is why we need to always support Israel as strongly as we can, because under any circumstance, Israel is ours. And we don't have to worry about our political allegiance and where we live. When push comes to shove, Israel is ours. So I think Cynthia's right. There's a sense of, yeah, we're here and we're okay, but. And we never know when the but is going to turn into an oh boy kind of a but.
Very nice, right. And but may even be the wrong conjunction.
Right.
Yeah, and might be a better conjunction there.
Wait, can I say one other thing, what Fran said? It's not that Israel belongs to us, it's that we belong to Israel. It's funny how I didn't think about it till Fran was just speaking that I was actually born in Germany, and my dad was born in Hungary, my mother in the United States. And I guess I do have like a gypsy feel that I have always felt, even though I'm not the age, the older age that when they fought for Israel. But I always do think of Israel as that's my country because that one's there, like as a fantasy or something. Like, I guess that's why I use the word stepchild, because it's a fantasy that there's a country there for me.
Very interesting. I'm going to help us to move us along just because one of the main points of this lesson is to see a lot of different perspectives on the same question. So, so far, we've seen one, Borowitz, writing in 82, saying, what's the relationship between Israel and the diaspora? Well, those of us Jews who live in the diaspora owe political allegiance to the countries where we live, but we maintain some sort of ethnic sense of feeling or ethnic, I'm looking for a word that he uses here. Doesn't matter, an ethnic feel for Israel nonetheless. Let's move on to a different thinker. We're going to move to Abraham Joshua Heschel. And taking Andy's good comment into account, note that this Heschel piece is written in 1969, so just 2 years after the 67 war, which again I said was a moment of sort of unifying Jewish strong feeling for the state of Israel. So again, is there someone who by either unmuting yourself or by using the raise hand function would volunteer yourself to read this Heschel passage, which I will again share on the screen? Don't be shy. There's no Hebrew.
Text 7?
Okay, Alan, go for it. I'll share my screen.
On 319?
On 315, Abraham Joshua Heschel, a re-examination.
Aha. What part did the state of Israel play in the day-to-day life of the Jews outside the land until recent events? It was a footnote to one's existence, enjoyed as a fringe benefit, a nice addendum, a side dish, a source of self-congratulation and pride. Israel was a place to visit, a place of pleasure and tourism, not a challenge, not a voice demanding mediation, not an urging for spiritual renewal, for moral re-examination. We have been occupied with many vitally important issues. We disregarded the challenge of Israel. We have failed to clarify its meaning, its value to our existence. We have failed to convey its significance to our Christian friends.
I'll pause you there for 1 second and just add my own little commentary. He's saying that until recent events, until the 1967 war, we American Jewry just took Israel for granted. We thought of it as like a place for tourism. We were excited by like, oh, you bought some Jaffa oranges. Great, we're connected to Israel. We didn't feel it as like a deep part of our Jewish souls. But for him, something in 67 changed. Alan, would you continue reading for us?
A major weakness was to take the state of Israel for granted, to cease to wonder at the marvel of its sheer being. We forgot the pain, the suffering, the hurt, the anguish, and the anxiety which preceded the rise of the state. We saw the Hilton and forgot Tel Chai.
I'll pause you there and just unpack that last sentence for a second. The Hilton refers to the Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv on the beach, sort of like the main symbol of tourism to Israel, of luxury, of an economy that's doing well. The Hilton is like the Israel of like the Disney World version of Israel. Tel Chai, on the other hand, is the site of a famous battle in the pre-state era where a certain Israeli, or they weren't Israelis yet, where a certain Jewish fighter named Yosef Trumpeldor was killed in the battle. And his dying words were, it is good to die for one's country. And sort of like it's a symbol of like bloodshed that had to happen in order for the state of Israel to be born. Jewish bloodshed that had to happen in order for the state of Israel to be born. So when he says we saw the Hilton and we forgot Tel Chai, he's essentially saying we took advantage of the luxury of the beach, of the beautiful hotels, and of the Jaffa oranges. We forgot that there was a lot of sacrifice that went into the making of that state. Alan, I'll let you continue.
The land rebuilt became a matter of routine. The land as a home was taken for granted. The younger generation, seeing the state functioning normally, has the impression that this has been the case all along. They have no notion of the distress and strain, of the longing and dreaming of generations. There is another error in understanding the condition of the state of Israel. Many people assumed the condition of the state of Israel was absolutely assured, as if the effort of building had ended, the roads cleared, the task completed. People are ready to celebrate a completion rather than realizing that the economic, political, and spiritual development is still in a stage of beginning. The achievements are impressive, but the tasks are still immense. A supreme test in Jewish history has been imposed upon us. The eyes of all of our martyrs of the past, the eyes of all Jewish generations of the future are upon us. We face a decisive hour in the Jewish history, as well as a radical trial of our character and integrity as Jews. It calls for more than generosity. It calls for wisdom and sacrifice.
Thank you so much, Alan. So I have a couple of my own questions and reflections, but before I share my specific questions, I'll look to each of us for our own comments about this text. What here resonated with you? What here doesn't resonate with you? What here agitates you? Maybe even reflections on this Heschel piece so far. Okay, Jonathan, if you'll unmute yourself. Oh, Karen. And Karen, could you unmute yourself in the bottom left-hand corner? There you go.
It's Karen.
Yes.
Jonathan was on the computer earlier, so it identifies as Jonathan. But what I was going to say is that for me, what Heschel seems to be saying is that we have lost the sense of the miracle of the state of Israel, and that people who are just looking at it as a great place to visit and not a place that we struggled for and that was kind of a dream come true, that they do take it for granted, and that it is not at the core of who we are as Jews, that it doesn't have that significance for those. But those who appreciate the history of how we got there really appreciate so much more about, as I said, the miracle that we actually have the state of Israel, and the fact that it's so foundational to our being as Jews.
And can I ask you a question, Karen?
Sure.
Does that resonate for you?
It does. That resonates for me, and also what he said about the younger generation not having that same appreciation, because they look at all the political controversy without looking at what it took to build a state of Israel and to achieve that dream.
I'm glad you picked up on that sentence. Every time I've read this text, it occurs to me that you could write, that many Jewish writers today would write the exact same sentence and be no less speaking the truth, that there are certain younger generations of the Jewish people who don't remember the bloodshed that caused, that enabled the state of Israel to exist. And those thinkers would say that that's an important thing that's lacking, that would enable people to feel more strongly the significance of the state of Israel. So thanks for that comment.
Thank you.
Okay, Diane, you can unmute yourself.
Diane is really Mike.
Sorry, Mike.
That's fine. The Hilton Tel Chai reference, I think, is more than just that. I think he's commenting on the change of the very fundamental nature of the state of Israel. Israel was founded in the 40s and 50s and even before by the kibbutz movement. I mean, they're the ones who died at a much higher percentage during the war than anybody else. And they were a bunch of left-wing radicals, socialists. By the 60s, especially the mid to late 60s, Israel was becoming very much a capitalist country. They were mimicking everything. The stock market was king in Israel back in the late 60s. It was changing from what it was in the very beginning to a mini United States, or it was trying to be. And it's continued. It's evolved and changed a few more times since then. So I think it's more than just Hilton Tel Chai. I think it's the very nature of Israel changed a lot post 67, and is changing again in my mind since 2000, but different discussion.
Great comment, really, really great comment. I'm glad you raised that other element of it. Russell. And I'll let you unmute yourself, Russell.
Thank you. Here's what does not resonate with me in that passage. The state of Israel was founded so that the Jewish people would have a state that would be a country like any other country. And we got our wish. people go there as tourists and they have a good time and do not necessarily wallow in the past, just as if you were to visit any other country, you would go to the beach and enjoy yourself. And complaining that the new generation doesn't remember these things, well, maybe that's the fault of those who taught them. But, you know, it's sort of like saying, you know, we have to sit here and wallow in the sacrifices that our grandparents and great-grandparents made when they swam the Baltic and came to America and worked in thread factories. Did they come here so that we would spend our lives wallowing in that? Or did they come here so that we would live lives like any other person that would, at some point, forget about those sacrifices?
Really nice comment. And I'll add only just two little bits of color commentary. One is that there's a punk rock song, an Israeli punk rock song, that takes that quote from Tel Chai, that it's good to die for one's country, and sort of like spins it on its head and says, like, is it really so good to die for one's country? You can picture sort of like the ethos of punk rock, saying like, really? Well, I'm not sure I actually believe that it's good to die for my country. That's my first little color comment. And the second one is, you'll notice in the second bullet point on the handout that I circulated, the following statement. Some Jewish thinkers argue that if political Zionism is the movement for a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel, then when that state was established, Zionism was achieved and completed. So that's like one school of thought, is like, once there was a state, Zionism was achieved, and there's no more such thing as like continuing to be a Zionist. Now you're like Israeli-ist or something like that. Heschel, that seems to fit somehow with Russell's point. Heschel sort of is arguing a different thing, saying that, okay, we achieved the state, now we need to do something more. We need to help continue the economic, the political, the spiritual development of the state of Israel. By the way, I'm not saying necessarily that Russell agrees with those thinkers who say that Zionism is over once the state is done, but what he said reminded me of that comment. Okay, I think last comment on this text will come from Alan. Go for it, Alan. I don't need you to unmute yourself.
Okay.
You had your hand up. Was there a comment you wanted to make?
Yes. I think that it's a more complicated thing than just saying, well, we fought for a state of Israel and we won it, and now we have other kinds of conditions. I think a lot of the current political turmoil is because by declaring the state of Israel and by being recognized as the state of Israel, we initiated the expulsion of all of the Eastern Jewish population from all of the Arab lands. And so that today, the state of Israel is more than 50% Middle Eastern, and the number of people from the Ashkenazi group from Europe is struggling to reconcile that situation.
An important comment, another sort of undercurrent in the story of Israel's history. Mike pointed out for us sort of the shift from a collectivist spirit to a capitalist spirit. And Alan's pointed out for us sort of the shift from like an Ashkenazi homogeneity to a much more ethnically mixed Israeli society, starting first with the arrival of Jews from Middle Eastern lands. So thanks for raising that up for us, Alan. I'm aware of the time, and I'm aware that I wanted us to see 5 different perspectives on this question. So I'm going to help to usher us along a little bit. I think we're actually going to skip text number 6, because first of all, it's long. And second of all, I don't think that it is the most important thing for us to look at, or will not generate the most dialogue for us. So, but before we move on to text number 7, let me sort of summarize where we are so far. Not that it's all that confusing, but it's helpful to like say where we've been. Borowitz said, it's great to feel pride for the state of Israel, to feel love for the state of Israel, but we don't owe it anything politically in terms of allegiance. Like, we don't get to vote there. We don't get to pay taxes there. There should be no claim for like dual loyalty. We love that country, but we're loyal to this one. Heschel is saying, you know what, we need to remember that actually Israel means something more than just the beach, that we're supposed to think about its economic, its political, its spiritual development. And I'd ask us all to sort of think on our own how we would respond to his last sentence. Israel calls for more than just generosity. It calls for wisdom and sacrifice. Whatever do you think he means by that? What kind of wisdom and sacrifice should each of us apply in our relationship with the state of Israel? Text 6, which we're not going to spend time on, is a statement from the conservative movement saying that they believe that Israel and the diaspora are mutually beneficial to one another. It's not a one-directional relationship where one always gives to the other or the other always gives to the one, but that we're mutually reinforcing to one another. That's sort of in contrast to a traditional view, like a religious nationalist view that would say that once there is a state of Israel, it becomes a mitzvah, that is an obligation of all of the Jewish people to reside there. The conservative movement puts a stake in the ground and says, actually, no, we don't think that becoming Israeli is required or even sufficient for a Jewish identity. These two communities have to be mutually reinforcing. And even if you are Israeli and you speak Hebrew, nevertheless, you should live some sort of Jewish life beyond just your passport and your language, meaning a Jewish religious or spiritual life. That's what text 6 is about. We're not going to dwell on it. We're going to look at text 7. So just noting, even before we start, that text 7 is the most recent among these texts, well, with the exception of text 8, of course. Text 7 was written in 2004. So is there someone who would read for us? This is on page 319 of the readers, Arthur Hertzberg. And you can let us know that you're willing to read by raising your hand or unmuting yourself. Okay, either Andy or Joni, I'll let you unmute yourself. And I'll share my screen. Go for it, Arthur Hertzberg.
Did I unmute myself? Yes.
Yeah.
I would like to read this because Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg was my rabbi growing up.
Wow.
He was the rabbi at our temple when I was bar mitzvahed. He was very much a larger-than-life character, and not just a little bit intimidating and frightening when you're the bar mitzvah boy.
I'm sure. Well, he's an amazing writer and thinker. So I'd love to have you read this.
No, but truly a great scholar and a great supporter of the state of Israel. In the middle of the First World War, the then Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, expressed his growing exasperation with the poor results on the front against the Germans by declaring that, quote, "war is too serious a matter to leave to the generals," close quote. Nearly 40 years after the great victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, the world Jewish community is finally on the verge of saying out loud, Israel is too serious a matter to leave its future in the hands of the factional politicians who make up its governments. In fundamental fact, Jewish interests in the Holy Land were never deeded by the international community exclusively to those who live there. The root of the Jewish claim under international law to the right to establish a national presence in the land of their ancestors lies in the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. The British government addressed this document to a leading figure in the diaspora, Lord Rothschild of England, rather than to the chief Jewish negotiator and then de facto leader in Britain of the World Zionist Organization, Dr. Chaim Weizmann.
I'm going to pause this just right there for 1 second, Andy, just to unpack those first two paragraphs only a little tiny bit. In the first paragraph, he's saying, in the last sentence, he says, this is his words, Israel is too serious a matter to leave its future in the hands of the factional politicians who make up its government. Or in other words, Israel is important and all world Jewry should have a voice, should have a say, should have something to say about it. That was just my setup for helping to unpack the last part of the second paragraph, where he says, the establishment of the state of Israel is founded on the Balfour Declaration, which is in itself a thing written by the British government and addressed to British Jewish leadership, not to like the pre-state Jewish leadership in the land of Israel. So he's building his case that it's always been such that the international community, in the international Jewish community in particular, has and ought to have a voice in the affairs of what would be the state of Israel. Okay, Andy, would you continue for us?
Yeah. At the moment when this declaration was made, there were 50,000 Jews in Palestine and over 500,000 Arabs. Nonetheless, the British government declared that the need of the Jews for a home of their own and the long-standing connection of this worldwide people with the Holy Land entitled them to superior consideration. The Balfour Declaration expected that an international Jewish agency would be constructed to foster the growth of the Jewish connection with the land. To this day, even after its creation as a sovereign state in 1948, Israel has presumed, without question, that the Jews of the world are obligated by special concern to help the upbuilding of the new entity. The basic institutions of the diaspora are expected to carry a special burden, both economic and political, in the defense of Israel. The trouble with this construct is that there is no mechanism whatsoever through which concerned Jews of the diaspora can give effective voice to opinions that the incumbent government of Israel does not want to hear.
Pause right there for one more second, just to add that there is actually such a mechanism, and we just had it. Many of us voted in the World Zionist Congress. Every 5 years, World Jewry gets to have some say in the Israeli political process. Granted, it's a relatively small say, but there is some mechanism, but it's not a major one. Okay, Andy, keep going.
Israeli politicians have said aloud for decades that they make it their goal to dominate every body in which they supposedly consult Jewish opinion that might be critical. From right to left, each prime minister has expected the leaders of the diaspora to obey their political line and never to dissent. The American Jewish community is torn right now between its love of Israel and its distaste for Israel's policies. We who love Israel have an obligation to say what we believe. We have for a century or more helped and supported the Zionist endeavor in the state of Israel. We have long lived with the notion that Israeli governments, from right to left, have tried to inculcate in us that they determine policy, and we are privileged to say amen on cue. This nonsense is now bankrupt. That definitely sounds like Arthur Hertzberg. More than 2 centuries ago, the American colonists revolted against the English government under the slogan, "No taxation without representation." The Jewish revolt is now brewing. Its slogan should be, "We cannot allow Israel's policies to be made by politicians from small factions who are protecting their particular partisan turf. We need statesmanship to think of Israel's lasting interests, of its place in the world, and of its deepest moral traditions."
All right, thank you, Andy, so much for reading. And again, just noting that this text comes from 2004, different period than the other texts we've been looking at the time of writing, often influences or tells us something about the content. I have lifted up what I think is maybe the key sentence of this statement in our little handout on the second page. I think the key sentence is, "We who love Israel," this is Hertzberg saying, "We who love Israel have an obligation to say what we believe." Another sort of way of summarizing the main thrust of this argument is how the Melton people title this text. They title it, "World Jewry is not an Amen chorus." So having given at least what I and the Melton editors would summarize as like the core of the argument, I'm really curious to know how this text either resonates with you or doesn't, agitates you. Let's hear your comments. And Andy, I see that you're still unmuted. Is that because you'd like to add a comment?
No, I guess I could comment, but let's let others comment.
Okay, fine. So Marcia, you're unmuted. Would you like to share something? Marcia, we actually can't hear you, although it shows you as unmuted. Still not hearing you. It seems maybe your microphone isn't picking you up. Are others hearing her? Sorry, Marcia. If you're able to figure out your microphone, or if you're able to add your comment in the chat box, we'd love to hear what you have to say. We just can't hear you, even though it's showing that you're unmuted. While Marcia's working on the tech, anyone else who wants to get a comment in on this text? Okay, Linda. And you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
We who love Israel have an obligation to say what we believe, but we sort of feel like it doesn't matter. And I think that certainly the American Jewry, and I don't know about the Jewry around the rest of the world, is angry about the lack of religious pluralism in Israel. Certainly us girls are mad that we can't worship at the wall, and things like that are creating a rift between the diaspora Jewry and Israeli Jewry. And one of my parents' best friends was a religious school teacher at Temple Israel in New Rochelle. And my dad always said that she was a gunfighting Israeli that fought with the Haganah, with guns and rifles, and she did. And she was like such a role model, for me. Her name was Leah Harris. And I think about what she would have to say about Israel today. I don't know. It's very hard.
Thanks for sharing that, Linda. Ed, I saw that you unmuted yourself.
Well, I just want to pick up that point. I mean, I was just trying to think about it. I don't know where actually Andy, your rabbi, was from or was practicing as a leading of a congregation, but would he potentially change his views if he were living in Israel or had grown up in Israel or was living in England or France? And think about how the lens of us reading that and studying that as Jews living in New York would be different if we lived someplace else in the world.
Interesting comment. Mike. Oh no, it's Diane.
So this is an argument that I've heard over and over. Do we have the right to tell the Israelis how to govern themselves? We're here, they're there, they're the ones who get shot at, we're not. And is it our place to determine how they run their affairs? On the other hand, you have recourse. You don't have to give them money if you really disagree with what they're doing.
That's true.
Politically, you don't have, if you're not going to go over there and participate in their society and put your life on the line, do you really have the right to say, we don't like what you're doing?
Interesting comment, and that's true. We can, if for people who feel that they want to be more involved in the Israeli political process and who feel that without being a citizen, they shouldn't have a voice, then Aliyah is the way to get involved. I want to sort of maybe just return to Ed's comment, which is not about the difference between being in the diaspora and being in Israel and the perceived rights of those who live there to make decisions compared to those in the diaspora. I just wanted to lift up that I think what Ed was saying is that if we had a different experience, different Jewish lives that maybe felt more under threat than here in the New York area, would we feel differently about the actions that Israel takes one way or the other? I think last comment on this is going to be from Russell.
Well, part of it is a uniquely American perspective because we believe we have the right to tell every country what to do and how to run themselves. And Israel is no different in that regard. I think I would be very interested in hearing what scholars in Argentina or Jewish scholars in Russia would have to say on this subject.
Really interesting question. And I invite you to look into that and let us know what you learn. We're we are at our time barrier. So let me just say what text 9 says, because we won't have time to read it together. It sort of makes the opposite argument to Hertzberg. If Hertzberg is saying American Jewry ought to have, or diaspora Jewry more broadly, ought to have a voice in the governing affairs of Israel, then text, I guess it's 8, I got one number ahead of myself. Text 8 by Professor Shlomo Avineri, who's an Israeli thinker, is saying, I understand that Americans may see things differently than us, and put up or pay up, if I got that phrase right. Pay up or put up. I don't know how to speak in jargony phrases like that, or colloquial phrases like that. If you want to, Avineri is saying, if you want to have a voice, then come be a citizen. So the 4 texts that we looked at really present a broad, diverse array of ways of thinking about the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. Borowitz saying we can love Israel, but our allegiance is to the United States. Heschel saying we need to remember that Israel is a place that requires something moral and spiritual of us, a place that ought to live like deep in our kishkas and not just like in our tourism or in our spending. And then Hertzberg saying we diaspora Jews have a responsibility to be involved in and contribute to the Israeli political decision-making process. And then an Israeli thinker sort of pushing back on that and saying, no, you won't have to live with you American Jews or diaspora Jews more broadly won't have to live with the consequences of any of the decisions of the policies that you're advocating for, come get some skin in the game if you want to be a part of the decision making. And again, I don't think that I know that I myself feel resonance with different parts of each of these. And I am really thankful for this group being able to engage this conversation, which again, as I started out by saying, is not always an easy one for us to engage without getting sort of embroiled and not able to hear one another. So thank you all for your ability to engage that and do so in a civil way. That's all that we have for tonight. I hope everyone has a great week. Hope you're all staying healthy and well and safe. And we'll see you next week, same time, same place. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.